right, let's see what CNN have to say in their closing arguments.
Appreciate it. Try to do it on a quick turnaround.
We're getting every time right.
Sure. Time and a half of 0.
All right.
I haven't had a chance.
Oh,
Thank you, Your Honor. So I haven't had a chance to talk to you since 9 days ago. And it's funny, I mean, we did voir dire and we kind of talked about who was on juries, but when you're lawyers sitting in court, you're constantly watching the jurors. What can I see? What can I read in a look? What can I read in a smile? And then we get the questions. The questions help. But one thing that we can tell is that you all have been incredibly diligent, which when you're a trial lawyer, of course you want to win your case. Of course. Mr. Friedman wants to win. His partners want to win. We want to win. No doubt about that. But one thing we really hope we get is a jury that cares and a jury that's going to spend their time looking through the evidence and doing the right thing. And I think that we all can agree that you are that jury.
yeah. If they look at the evidence, you're screwed.
I'm going to repeat a phrase probably 35 times during my closing, and I'm going to apologize ahead of time. But it's a phrase that it's not black market. Don't you won't have to hear it. You'll hear that a lot, but it won't be. This is going to be more. It's the phrase common sense, because you all were selected to be put on this jury because of your common sense. It's what
Oh, common sense, like your reporters lacked.
we all want. It's in the instructions. I forget what page it's on, but when you go back and look at the instructions, it says use your common sense. To
Sorry, I will shut up.
I cannot ask you to do that more. Use your common sense and your life experiences. When you all get together and talk about the case, when you look at the video, when you read the article, when you look at some of the communications, use your common sense and ask yourself just right off the bat, are you seeing a conspiracy? Or are you seeing people try to do their best? I submit it's the latter. Mr. Friedman obviously thinks it's the former. But that's why you're there, because you've lived your lives, like you've gone to work, right? You've talked to your friends. You know how people think. You know when somebody writes a really stupid offhand comment, it doesn't mean they hate someone. It doesn't mean when they want to destroy their lives. Maybe they're reacting to something really, really bad that they just saw. But what we're asking is that when you look at those things, you use your common sense, because that's how you figure out what the truth is. And I'm not going to ask you today to send a message. I'm going to ask you to find the truth. I'm going to ask you whether CNN defamed Mr. Young. That's it. That's what this case is about. You all didn't come and sit in this jury to deliver a message to big media. You all came here and you took the oath that you would apply your common sense to the facts of this case. And that is all I'm asking. And I think when you do, you'll find that CNN did not defame Mr. Young. But let's get into it. So when I started, or when I opened, I should say that I was going to tell you that CNN's reporting was accurate, tough but fair. And I'm going to tell you that all day long. Sometimes stories get told, and they're true, but they're tough, right? They're tough because they tell the truth about someone, about what someone's doing. And obviously that person doesn't want to be talked about, but it happens. And you heard these various journalists, reporters, Katie Lillis. She feels like she's got a duty to tell stories about people. Sometimes they're tough stories. Now, I don't think this is a tough story, actually. There was a fair story. We're going to get into it, but Mr. Young, he didn't want to be reported on, no doubt about that. We see that in all those text messages. But he put himself in the middle of the story. He was out there. His advertisements to Afghans, as the court has already found, they were newsworthy. It was part of a big story. But I told you right in openings that I was going to talk about 3 things, and one is true. When you looked at Mr. Friedman, his closing, and when his partner Kyle wrote for the opening, they didn't want to show you the articles that this case is about. This is a defamation case. So the 2 most important things you all need to look at are the segment and the article. And I would say, look at them as many times as you can, because they're accurate, and they're true, and they're fair. The second thing I'm going to talk about is no defamation. Now, the instructions talk about defamation. You'll see all the instructions. We're going to go through it. The story that you were told by Mr. Friedman and his client was that Mr. Young had this deep bench of people really trusted clients, colleagues, people he worked with. But at trial, none of the receipts showed up. There were no people who talked about what a great reputation he had before the CNN publications. None of those people came to court. There were no people who showed up and said that he was untouchable, that they wouldn't work with him. None of those people showed up. There was no evidence that he was harassed or humiliated after the CNN.
Are you serious? You had a 2-star general there. And of course, his clients will not show up because they don't want their face there either. Have their chances of extracting people from other war zones just because you, well, not this attorney by default, but his clients, CNN. Yeah.
And publications. And opposing counsel said they were so obvious, they called them a criminal, blah, blah, blah. If that were true, you would see that type of evidence. It just doesn't exist. Use your common sense. No reputational harm. And that's kind of similar to what I was talking about. There's not a single person who showed up to testify to you that they wouldn't hire Mr. Young. He had this contract with Momentum. We're going to talk about it. And it went for 1 year, from 2020 November to November of 2021. And it wasn't renewed, right? Mr. Young said he never called up Momentum to ask why it wasn't renewed. He also testified that documents came from Momentum and none of them mentioned CNN. Now, if Momentum had not renewed the contract because of CNN, that's a really easily knowable fact, right? Somebody would have said, wow, we watch CNN. We can't work with that guy. It would be really easy to prove that. But no one came to court. And it's a big deal. Mr. Friedman made a huge deal about what a big lawsuit this was and how this man's life has been destroyed. And maybe he's right. But if he is right, you surely would have expected them to come to court with receipts. We're almost 3 years from that March 17th letter when Mr. Young wrote CNN saying, you better correct this or I'm going to sue you. 3 years. 3 years to marshal the evidence to show how badly I've been harmed. And you all got buckets, except for an expert witness who was paid. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But it shouldn't have been that hard. If this really was a defamation case, if this really was an instance where a man was torn down, where a man lost his...
If this was a close call, yeah, this is the kind of defense closing you would expect. But this isn't even a close call for me. It really isn't.
Life, where a man lost his career, it should be really easily apparent to bring that evidence to court. And you saw none of it. All you got was, I had this income one day, and I didn't have this income the next day. But if that were true, where were the witnesses? It should be really easy. Use your common sense. So, I want to talk about what the story is first. This is what the story was about. Mr. Marquardt told you this was an incredibly important moment in American history, and it was. 20 years of the U.S. being in Afghanistan, and then we blew it. The government blew it, and it was a major failure. And it was something CNN was reporting on a lot. This wasn't, as Mr. Marquardt said, this story wasn't a one-off, and it wasn't a hit piece. I started on a series of stories to highlight the efforts to try to get them out and get them to safety. This was a hugely important story in American history. And that's what he did. Now, Mr. Friedman.
I don't remember that quote being presented during trial. So, okay. So this is something, a made-up quote from somewhere.
Put up kind of that fake banner about what the story could have been about Mr. Young. He said this could have been a feel-good story. I submit that that's not the case. Mr. Young wasn't just a bit rough around the edges. You saw him on LinkedIn where people would say, hey, what's this price for? And he would say, run for the border. He would tell a woman he didn't know, F off. That's not the kind of guy who is the feel-good story. It just isn't. So we shouldn't oversell it. But let's talk about what the reporting in this case showed. So the case got started, and there's no doubt, the story got started by Joe Cornette saying, anyone interested in a story about an American mercenary charging people $13,000 per head. And how did she know about it? Because he was out there on LinkedIn, out in the open, advertising his services. And obviously it irritated her. Obviously she saw it as something wrong. And you'll see over these next 8 days, this is a timeline from October 20th to October 28th, Mr. Marquardt got all this information. And this is probably, it's not working, it is working. This is probably the most important one. Do you have a sponsor able to pay evacuation costs? Not really, but can I pay them myself? And Mr. Young says $14,500 per person. And that caught Mr. Marquardt's eye. Because as the story that was actually published, it was about the pressure that Afghans were facing. It was about the...
Yeah, sorry again. I know This should be in one segment, but you can all go to Law and Crime and watch this without my commentary. This is a commentary channel, folks. But what he avoids talking about here is that at what point was this sent? Now, we can see it is in a certain order. What if they just pressed send almost instantaneously? And then when Mr. Young saw it, okay, that was stupid. Just going to block. Because I believe these are some of the messages he got. He must have had many, many. And for you guys who are in the, for instance, me, and so social media on X and emails, and I don't have LinkedIn. I don't think I have LinkedIn. But I get so many messages. Once in a while, yes, I answer you. I read them, all of them. Sometimes I answer if it has something to do with what I do. But most of the time it is, check that case out. And I understand you guys. You want a person like me to cover a case you want. I don't have the time. My schedule is more or less up until more or less this entire year. I have cases I know I'm going to cover, and then I have a few, like this one, I stumbled upon. So don't be mad at me for not replying or not taking up your case, but there's, as I believe for Mr. Young, there's just too many messages.
The prices that Afghans were being charged. And Mr. Young, right there.
I will try to shut up now.
$14,500 per person. The court's found, and I know Mr. Friedman didn't like it. He didn't want to talk about it. But the court has already found that Mr. Young was directly advertising to Afghans. So we're going to show you a lot of them. But that's not all Mr. Marquardt saw. Mr. Marquardt and Ms. Lillis saw a man who, at a time when all of these veterans organizations were trying to fill this horrible void by the U.S. government, Mr. Young filled it and by charging a lot of money to try to make money for himself. It was exploitation. And they saw his messages, run for the border and see how far they get. And they saw his prices. And it was newsworthy. It was something that was worthy of being reported on. So Mr. Marquardt, he doesn't just run off and say, I'm going to get this guy, because he doesn't have that kind of power. CNN is a corporation, no doubt. But it's also a collection of individuals. And there's checks and there's balances. Mr. Marquardt couldn't just run off and say, I don't like this guy. I'm going to do the story. I'm going to get him. It doesn't work that way. He's got bosses. His boss has got bosses. It went through different levels of editing. Different people looked at it. But this is how it got kicked off. On October 28th, we saw this pitch, Extortion of Desperate Afghans. And so what Mr. Marquardt's really talking about here is this situation, this vacuum that got created in Afghanistan, where the U.S. government, major policy failure, and people are going to die. I mean, you heard it from General Young. You heard it from Mr. Young. You heard it from CNN's witnesses. It was bad. It was worth reporting on. The pressure that those people who had no hope were facing. And here's Mr. Young at the same time. He's advertising all over LinkedIn. He's saying, if you or someone in your network needs help with Afghanistan air evacs, please reach out. And it's got that little globe. Some of them say sponsor, no doubt. A lot of them don't. We are having success as recently as today, moving people overland into neighboring countries. And you would see these desperate pleas by Afghans reaching out. Hello, I'm an SIV holder, and I need your help to evacuate me from here. That's what the story was about. It was about the desperation of Afghans and how hopeless it was. Over and over and over again, Mr. Young was prominently advertising on LinkedIn his services. So, as we saw, Katie Bo-Lillis joins the reporting team with Alex Marquardt. And you saw Katie Bo-Lillis take the stand. I guess she's a co-conspirator now, but that's up for you to decide. Again, use your common sense when you evaluate the people who testified before you. But Katie Bo-Lillis, and this is what's really interesting about this case. Alex Marquardt learns about Zach Young about 10 days before this, and he starts looking into it. He doesn't share that information with Katie Bo-Lillis. But what happens? She finds out about it completely independent of Alex Marquardt. See attached text from one of these guys who is charging. His name is Zach, and he's literally advertising on LinkedIn. I've got a few shared connections, so I can do a little digging on who he is. He was so prominent in doing what he was doing that this Lillis, which randomly found him herself, which is crazy. I mean, it just shows how prominent he was doing this. The other thing is look at the content of the information that Ms. Lillis got. $15,000 passports, $5,000 visas. I mean, these are crazy things that Mr. Young was offering. And you heard him testify. He never provided any of those. But he was still all over LinkedIn offering these services. Now, Mr. Friedman told you Zach Young only worked with corporations and NGOs because they had the sophisticated ways to sell people. They had the sophisticated ways of moving people through immigration. If that were true, why is Mr. Young advertising passports and visas? It's not true. He was sending these out to everyone, to any Afghan, over and over again. So, as this gets going, Mr. Marquardt sees the Bloomberg and Audible, and Mr. Friedman talked about it, and we talked about it a lot. Mr. Young himself testified that Mayor Bloomberg was involved in evacuating people from Afghanistan. It was early on in the trial, but you may recall it. Alex Marquardt just didn't sit on his hands and say, I'm not going to check this out. He reached out to Mayor Bloomberg's people to find out whether it was true. And we know that he probably got some traction because Mr. Young reached out to Katie Bill Lillis and told her, I've heard CNN's been asking about me. So we know that Mr. Marquardt's reach out efforts were effective. Somebody was looking. Now, we never got confirmation from Bloomberg. But for some reason, Mr. Young contacted Katie Bill Lillis out of the blue. Now, Audible, you heard, Mr. Marquardt didn't think that Audible would be in Afghanistan, but it wasn't like he was trying to bury it. You can see in his Slack messages between him and Katie Bill Lillis, they talk about it. Audible, question mark? Why would Audible be in Afghanistan? Now, if this was this big conspiracy from the beginning, would you see that in a Slack message between two people? Of course not. And really, just one point I'll make really quickly. Mr. Friedman and his team had all of these messages.
You conveniently forgot that Mark got actual names of actual human traffickers, and he didn't care. He was solely after Mr. Young.
Just to ask people all of these questions. How do they have them? CNN didn't destroy any of these things. You got to see the truth. You got to see everything that was going on because CNN didn't destroy it. The only person who destroyed their messages before this trial was Mr. Young. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. So, as you know, Ms. Lillis starts texting with Mr. Young. And Mr. Young immediately starts kind of exaggerating. He said he gets requests from journalists on a daily basis. He's in full cell mode. Full cell mode. He's exaggerating about the sponsors. And remember his testimony when he said, oh, I meant sponsor. It was just a typo. But go look at his messages. They're all written in the plural form. And I know that there's been a lot of parsing of words. But you saw Mr. Young on the stand. He couldn't admit that he was exaggerating to Katie Bill Lillis. And why is that important? I mean, I guess sponsors, that's not a big deal. But if you can't admit that you were exaggerating on the stand, how can you trust everything he's telling you? And a lot of their case relies on what Mr. Young tells you because he doesn't have the receipts for his damages, for his reputation, for his destruction of evidence, for what he told his Austrian doctors. Ms. Lillis and Mr. Young go back and forth. And you can see, this is like the reporting. This is how the guts of reporting. And of course, Mr. Young didn't have to talk to her, but he kept doing it. And all Ms. Lillis was trying to do was to get information, because that would help the story. He says, Katie Bill Lillis is flat out. I know that Mr. Friedman really pushed her and this idea that she wasn't being honest with him. But you see at the end of this conversation, that's part of what I hope to talk about, the price model. Our understanding is you're asking for $75K for a vehicle to Pakistan and around $15K for a single person to UAE. That seems exorbitant.
Jesus Christ, how long is this guy going to go on? Jesus Christ, for another hour and a half. No, that's rebuttal. Let's see if this is just more of the same.
About what she was interested in. Young didn't have to respond. That is his right. You all ask questions about that. He absolutely didn't have to, but he kept responding and she kept asking more questions because she's a journalist. She's a reporter. She wanted to learn. She wanted to understand what he was doing.
She was a honeypot.
But he didn't ultimately give her the information. And that gives her less info to go by. And that gives CNN less info to go by. And at the end of the day, this is a case where Mr. Young says, well, you didn't include this about me. Well, Mr. Friedman said this is a case about choices. It is a choice. Mr. Young could have said, I work for Audible. I work for Bloomberg. I work for Civil Fleet. I work for Hero. Here were all the
Why would he do that? So by that time, he knew you were gunning for him, aiming for him. By that time, he at least suspected it. So why would he reveal his clients, putting them through the risk? And what you're asking for here, Mr. Attorney, is Young should have revealed his organization. He should have revealed this, and this. No, because why not? Well, because that would put everybody at risk. And you didn't care. CNN didn't care.
the connections for those people. He could have said that. And they would have followed up. And maybe we wouldn't be here today. But Mr. Young didn't. Instead, he made up this kind of exaggeration that he aligns sponsors with Afghans and then provided no information about it. But what was pretty clear was at this time, Mr. Young was making a lot of money from these Afghan evacuations. And he didn't want it to become public. And that's fine. General Young said, it's a matter of opinion. You may like these charging a lot of money. You may not like it. You may think it's bad to war profiteer. You may think it's good to war profiteer. But it's a matter of opinion. Mr. Young had a right to make a 66% profit margin. Nobody's saying that. But we in America can have opinions about these things. And some people don't think it's a good thing. Mr. Young didn't want to disclose it, but here are the numbers. This is what we learned in Discovery. In about a 2.5-month period, you received $456,000 with a profit margin of 65.5%. That's the math that was very easy to do that he didn't want to share with Katie Bowe. Because he didn't want her to know. Because this would have been newsworthy. It would have been newsworthy that because of this vacuum in Afghanistan, that someone was coming in and filling the void with really high prices.
And again, CNN, how many did you save? Oh, is that number 0, CNN? 0? Yes, that number is 0. And you probably, this action of yours, that hit piece, making sure Mr. Young's reputation was gone, probably killed Afghans. Just so you could have a 4-minute segment, bring in some clicks and some ad revenue.
You can see that this keeps going on. Mr. Young says, pricing always depends on local resource availability. Well, this wasn't true. The pricing was dependent on his profit margin. He then says, no Afghan is expected to pay for evac costs. None would ever be able. Rather, we're focused on aligning corporate sponsors. But ultimately, he agreed when he took a stand that his prices were exorbitant. He knew that. He just didn't want to share it. That's his right. But in a case about choices, you don't get to say, I'm not talking, and you know there's a story about you, and they say, you didn't include my information. Mr. Young never provided the information that he wanted to include.
So you made shit up.
Again, Katie Bowe says, can you point me to some cases where you've successfully connected a sponsor and an evac case? And you heard Mr. Levine say that if they got that information, that would have gone into the story. Maybe it would have gone in a completely different direction.
That's the thing, Mr. Attorney. That part of successful, you were trying to get a story on more or less human trafficking. Successful evacuations would never have been a part of this story. And instead of checking the actual leads you had provided to Alex, Mark, if you followed on those actual leads, then you would have had a person who probably fit better to the story. But you were gunning for Mr. Young.
I mean, Mr. Young testified on the stand, but CNN asked him. They asked him about his successful operations, but he never gave any examples. This court has already found that Mr. Young advertised directly to Afghans. And so Mr. Friedman's kind of bobbing and weaving about only need sponsors, only advertising to sponsors. This isn't true. I mean, we saw in the exchange with Joe Kornetsky, one of the very first advertisements, August 20th of 2021, Mr. Young reached out to Joe Kornetsky. Joe Kornetsky was not a corporate sponsor. The story just doesn't make sense. Mr. Young was advertising directly to Afghans. The court found he didn't take any money. but he was directly advertising to Afghans, and he was what the story was about. Really high prices to desperate people. Again, Katie Bowe asked, we're not in any rush. This is November 3rd. And as we get to the end of the call, the end of the...
Okay, yeah, it's just going to be more of the same. Yeah, folks. I'm going to the rebuttal closing here.
Or defamation by implication. You certainly will find that there is no reason to come back again and talk about punitive damages. This case is about the truth of this case. It's not about sending a message. Thank you all for your time.
And a swoop. Now, I will probably cut out this as an entire segment. For you who don't want to watch the whole stream, or if you want to go to the highlights, this will be a highlight of sorts.
Good. Can't believe I'm saying this, but I agree with CNN's lawyers. Use your common sense. Think about that for a second. Use your common sense, but ignore the fact that CNN's lawyers knew black market meant illegality and therefore made the corporation apologize immediately. Use your common sense, but ignore all the pre-litigation admissions they made before they were here to see you guys. Use your common sense, but ignore 7 witnesses all testifying to a uniform non-dictionary definition of an English language. Use your common sense, but you need lines of witnesses to tell you what the words in English mean, and we're at fault for not bringing you a line of people to tell you what English means. Use your common sense, but don't rely on a dictionary. Use your common sense, but ignore a 2-star general. Use your common sense, but trust Mr. Axelrod instead of the only psychiatrist you heard from in the entire trial. Use your common sense, but ignore the fact that CNN had no doctor come tell you that Mr. Young's mental health issues were fake. You only had a lawyer telling you that. Use your common sense, ignore the fact that the Helios contract had no money exchange. You have all of his bank records in there in evidence, but you can bet your bottom dollar if there was a payment from Helios, they would have showed it to you because they have them too. Use your common sense, but ignore that. Use your common sense, but trust CNN's expert who has no opinion on whether all the efforts of updating, linking, and going on monster.com will actually work. He says no opinion on whether it'll actually work. Use your common sense, but ignore the fact that the 2-star general told you it wouldn't work. Use your common sense, but ignore the fact that the CPA came up and calculated what lost profits are. Use your common sense, but trust a lawyer who can't do math without a calculator. Use your common sense, but trust our experts who isn't giving an opinion on any money at all, right? Mr. Buss didn't offer opinion on damages. Use your common sense, but trust witnesses. But use your common sense, but think about this. CNN had the compulsory power to bring witnesses here too. Mr. Young told you why he didn't bring his network of people. They're quiet professionals. His life and reputation has been ruined by being forced into the limelight like this. So what Mr. Axelrod is saying is he should have pulled all of his friends and used this court's compulsory power to bring them here, broadcast them across the internet, and destroy their careers too. Now, to be clear, CNN could have brought you those people. You think it's hard to find Leon Panetta? You think it's hard to find Mike Morrell? They had compulsory power. They didn't bring them. Ask yourself, use your common sense. If Leon Panetta was going to say bad things about Mr. Young, if Mike Morrell was going to say bad things about Mr. Young, why didn't CNN bring him? We told you why we didn't bring him. It makes sense. He's not going to ruin their careers too. We don't need it. We have all the receipts. Use your common sense. He says, tell you to bring all these witnesses to tell you what English means, what words mean, when we have all of their internal documents. Use your common sense, but ignore the fact that this man was making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, year after year after year. The CNN broadcast comes out and his income goes to zero. It's undisputed. Use your common sense, but they're not responsible for it. Use your common sense, but assume that lost LinkedIn messages were relevant to this case when the court has told you he did nothing illegal, and you have to decide whether he did something illegal and whether black market means anything illegal. Use your common sense, but ignore. But lost LinkedIn messages make a difference when what you're looking at is what CNN published, not what he said. We know that he did not take money from Afghans because the court told you that. So, yes, use your common sense. Use your common sense, but trust the liar Alexander Marquardt on the stand who lied to us over and over and over. Use your common sense, but Ignore the fact that Fuzz Hogan, one of CNN's triad members, told you he approved a story that was 3/4 true. Use your common sense, he says, but let this madness continue. Use your common sense, but ignore the fact that the explanation for the issues with the Austrian medical records is translation issues. Use your common sense, but ignore the fact that Dr. Vincent told you that he's unconcerned about it because it's a translation issue. So please, use your common sense. I want to touch on some other things that Mr. Axelrod talked about. Mr. Young isn't running from responsibility. He absolutely advertised to Afghans as a technical matter, but he's explained why that was. It's just a public post on the internet. The court found as a technical matter he did advertise to Afghans. That's true. That's not his target audience. We've covered that. Mr. Axelrod told you that Mr. Young's advertisements were so large that Katie Lillis found him, but Katie Lillis testified that she and Mr. Young had connections in common. You know how social networks work. The fact that you have shared connections means your post will get posted to the friends of your friends. It wasn't that he was so prolific, it was that they were connected. You know, Mr. Axelrod talked about how it is about choices. He says Zachary Young could have chosen to speak to CNN, could have spoken, could have chosen to talk to them. But again, this is this guilty until proven innocent. Mr. Young had no obligation to talk to CNN. You know who had an obligation? CNN had an obligation not to go to press with falsehoods and lies and defamation. They're the news agency that broadcasts to 70 million homes. They're the ones with the responsibility, not us. If they couldn't confirm their story, they can't go to press. They can't then just pass the buck and say, oh, he could have corrected us if he wanted to. Mr. Young is not on trial here for running a profitable business from corporations that were happy to pay. CNN is on trial here because they published falsehoods and destroyed a man's life. I want to hit on something else. This idea that Mr. Young isn't mentioned until 3 minutes into the video. Mr. Axelrod hangs his hat on like it's a big deal, but anybody who knows how to tell a story, you build up for a suspense. I mean, think about the punchline of a joke. It's the last word of the joke, but it is the entire point of the joke. It doesn't matter where in time Mr. Young appears. It matters. The substance is what matters. And he was the punchline of this joke. You know, Mr. Axelrod talked about how Nicole Guyette, the internal reporter who said the inference running through this thing is really not fair. So that was an early version. But remember when I had Thomas Lumley on the stand, Mr. Axelrod put up a page that had a lot of red ink on it. And we zoomed in on that. We went through each and every edit. That story didn't really change. In fact, it got worse. They put in worse things into that story. And Mr. Axelrod says that this case isn't about sending a message. That's not true. If that were true, the law wouldn't allow you to award punitive damages. It does, and it does for a reason. Because there are times when companies like this need to be told to stop. And there's one way to get to a company like this, and it's to follow the money. That is the way you change the behavior of a company. You tell them that when they do something wrong, we will take it out of your bank account. When you do that, you send a message. And that's why punitive damages are here, to help you punish and to deter. When my child does something wrong, you need to punish them to stop them from doing that in the future. You send a message. This case is about sending a message. If it wasn't, you wouldn't have a packed courtroom. You wouldn't have the press in the back. CNN wouldn't be monitoring this case to see what you do. It is about sending a message. Make no mistake. It's about making him right. He suffered wrongfully, and he shouldn't have, economically and emotionally. But it's also about sending a message. We ask you to send that message loud and clear. End this madness. Bring American journalism back to the center. Bring Walter Cronkite back. We used to turn on our news, and we could rely on what was there. We can't anymore. You have the ability to fix it. You have the ability to send a message. Please do it.
Okay, that was the rebuttal. And yeah, that's good. That was good. Axelrod on CNN's behalf. Yeah, no. Nah. Yeah. This is not good for CNN. Not good at all.